So welcome to this week's Facebook Live. Thanks for all the comments last week. It was a kind of experiment. The experiment seemed to go quite well, so thank you. So I'm going to try and do this weekly. Next week we're going to have a live broadcast of a recovery story. But I think the idea is once a month we'll do that, and other Wednesdays we'll see how these Facebook Lives go. And if we keep getting engagement and you guys keep enjoying them, then we'll try and keep on doing them. I thought I'd take another step in the adventure this week and see if you want to try and post some questions as we're going through the session, and I'll try and answer some of those questions as well. So I'm going to see if I can juggle between watching, kind of recording the video, but also looking at questions on Facebook as well. So I thought what we do this week is build on a little bit what we talked about in last week's Facebook Live. So last week I talked about setting goals for recovery in a way which is sustainable. And one of the things I said was focusing on habits and behaviours as opposed to focusing on activity and how much you're actively doing. So I thought for this week we talk a bit more about cultivating positive habits. You know, changing habits and behaviours can feel incredibly difficult, and yet there are certain principles, there are certain ideas that can significantly facilitate and help that process. So I thought I'd just give a bit of a brain dump around some of the ideas around that. So, okay, starting point to that is, what is a habit? When we talk about a habit, what do we actually mean by that? So a habit is something that we do consistently. It's something that we have some kind of routine or some kind of consistency about doing. So hopefully you've got habits around things like personal hygiene. Most of us have a habit that in the morning, at some point when we go to bed, we clean our teeth. Most of us have habits around morning, particularly around particular foods you might have for breakfast. If we're someone that drinks coffee, someone that makes a vegetable juice. And there's almost a sequence that gets built in that supports those habits. We often also have habits around leaving the house. So we have habits around making sure we've got our keys, making sure we've got our phone, putting on a coat, putting shoes on, and leaving the house. And it's highly unlikely that we would ever leave the house without having our shoes on, for example, because there's something that's built in to that routine. And it might be that we see the front door and then we feel or we check, am I wearing shoes? Or we get to the hallway and we look to see which shoes we've got on. So one of the secrets to understanding habits and changing habits is focusing on the structures and the routines that sit around the habits and then training a new habit in. So we talk in psychology about 4 different levels of competence. We talk about when you first learn something, you have to do it consciously, and it's conscious. Well, firstly, actually, you have conscious incompetence. So you become conscious of the fact that you can't do something. And then you move from conscious incompetence to conscious competence. So you get to the point that you can do something, but you have to consciously focus on that thing that you're doing. And then we build to the point that we get to unconscious competence. Unconscious competence means that we can simply do something without being aware that we're doing it. And unconscious competence is where a habit has got to the point that it becomes automatic. So, for example, if you drive a car, we have a whole bunch of unconscious competence about driving. And when we first learn to drive, we have to go for the point of being consciously incompetent, like recognizing we can't do it, to becoming consciously competent, to becoming unconsciously competent. And that process might be the first time that you learned to use a gear lever. And you had to kind of put the clutch down and change gear and lift the clutch up. There's a whole process around doing that. Then you train the habit, and then you can do that without even thinking about the process of doing it. And you get to the point that you drive a car and you change gear multiple times, and at no point do you consciously think about that process. So when we're looking at changing a habit or cultivating a positive new habit, then we want to actively train ourselves and build into a sequence that we do something enough times that we become habituated in that thing that we're doing. And so if you start to think about some of the habits that you might want to cultivate, and these might be habits around things to do with remembering to take supplements, or it might be habits around building a meditation practice, or it might be habits around learning when to stop, like recognizing that your limits before you hit your limits and getting a new habit in place with that. There might be, for example, a certain feeling you get when you're reaching your limits. And for some people, that can be like a feeling that you just feel like you run out of energy, you get a bit tired and shaky, and then you kind of get more adrenalized. And you know that when you reach that point, the likelihood is that if you continue in that state, it's going to lead to a crash. So you want to have a new habit that when you recognize that happening, there's a stop button that comes in. Or you want to train a habit around building in rest or around calming your nervous system. So you might want to think about what the actual habits are that you want to cultivate. And then what we want to think about is how do you build that into your routine? Like, what's the sequence of things that sit either side of that habit? Like, what's the trigger? So, for example, if it's wanting to sit to meditate in the morning and you have a routine around breakfast, the trigger is you finish breakfast and the next thing you go and do is you go and do that meditation practice. And you consistently then, for several weeks, you do that immediately afterwards. So you build that into the sequence. You train the habit. We talk in psychology about neuroplasticity. And this is the capacity of your brain to learn. And you do something enough times and you build neural pathways in your brain. You train a habit into your brain. You literally are training something into your nervous system. So another example might be that you, that example I gave, that you hit your limits physically. So you want to get really attuned to what that actual feeling is. Like, what does it feel like when you get to that point? And what's the next thing you want to do in that sequence? So the next thing might be, if you're around people, to say to them, I need to go and rest. Or if you're at home, it might be to stop what you're doing and immediately go and rest. So you figure out the trigger, and then you work out what the sequence, what the next steps are, and then you habitually do that a number of times. So that's the first piece of this. It's understanding the sequence, and then it's constructing what the new habit needs to look like. In a moment, I want to talk a little bit more about how to build some rewards into that. I'm just going to see if I can figure out how I can see the comments at the same time. This may or may not work, by the way, but those of you that are watching live, if you want to post questions or comments as we're going, I'm going to see if I'm capable of looking at those on my computer screen while I'm doing it. And you can also just say, it's helpful or it's useful or any questions or clarification. So the next piece that I want to come to, the kind of final kind of main piece with this, is building in some kind of reward system around it. We're all adults, and yet we have a similar psychology in many ways to children, that if we get a positive reinforcement for doing something, it makes us more likely to continue with that behavior. Like having focus and clarity on what it is that we want to do, having a clear sense of knowing when we've achieved that, and a clear sense of reward helps us in the process of committing to doing something. And so one of the things, we have a 5.5-year-old, a 3.5-year-old, and baby number 3 due next week. And we, one of the things we do with the two kids at the moment is if they collect 10 marbles, they each have a jar, and if they do something that's really good behavior, they get a marble and that goes in the jar. And when it gets to the point of being 10 marbles in the jar, they get a little bit of money, they get £5 or £10 to go to the toy shop and choose a toy. And they don't get marbles for doing things that they should be doing anyway. So it's not, every time they just kind of do data stuff, they get a marble. But they do something which is a stretch, like something which is outside of their normal habits and behaviors. So just as an example, our eldest is struggling with kind of sharing toys, particularly at the moment. So today she was being picked up from school, and her auntie was also there, and she was having a biscuit, and the auntie said, you know, God, those biscuits smell great. And she offered a biscuit. Without being asked for it, she offered to share it, and she got a marble. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that you guys get marbles, but you have marbles if you want, but suggesting that thinking about if there's something that particularly that, you know, you enjoy to do that you don't do all the time. And that might be watching a movie that you particularly want to watch on the TV. It might be particular food reward, which is not a million miles off being okay in terms of kind of dietary thing. But if you manage to maintain this new habit 5 times or 8 times or 10 times or whatever it may be, then you get that. And it's easy as an adult to go, oh, I don't need that stuff. I'm too grown up and kind of mature for this. But this is not really about what your conscious mind is thinking. It's about training a habit into your unconscious. And the unconscious works in sequence. So that's why I focused on what the triggers are, the thing that's the sequence and the kind of output of that, and building rewards, into the process to reinforce the habit. You'd be surprised how effective it is, and consistently reassessing it, like setting a clear goal and intention around what you're doing, and then having set that clear goal and intention, checking in with yourself. So if you say you're going to do this, checking with yourself once a week or whatever, and then setting a reminder in your phone, so you get that reminder, and then you actively do that. And just a reminder, if you guys do want to post questions, we've got another minute or so that I'm going to talk for. And if there are questions, I'll answer them. And if not, then feel free to put them in the comments. And I can also try and jump on the comments in a day or two time. But remembering that part of this is also being your own coach, and part of being a really good coach is a good coach checks in and supports. And it's easy to get kind of strongly kind of motivated to kind of around something like this, but you need to make sure you check in to see, is it working? Is the habit, are you stretching yourself too much? And remember, these are around changing habits and behaviors, not around pushing yourself in terms of energy level, but being supportive towards yourself. And that means making the time to check in and see where you are in the process of what you're doing. So that's it for this week. As I say, post questions, comments underneath. I'll jump on in the next day or two and respond to comments, questions that are there. The plan is this time next week, we have got a live recovery story with a recovered patient. Oh, we got a question from Susan. What if you're struggling to find the reason for a crash? How do you find the line to cross when it constantly moves? So it's a good question, and it's sometimes a really tricky one, and it's sometimes one which is more tricky than you might anticipate. Put it in slightly different terms, we talk a lot about establishing a baseline, and finding a baseline sometimes it's really easy, and other times it keeps changing, and when it keeps changing, we need to identify the reasons for the changes. Are those reasons to do with things like blood sugar and nutrition? Are those things to do with external factors around you, like noise, busyness, changes in schedule? Are they to do with pushing oneself too much? Like that can also just be we keep wanting the baseline to be higher than it is. And so each time we try to follow a baseline, we try to put the line above where it should be, and then we keep on crashing, and then we keep going around in a loop. So sometimes we need some external help as well to identify what are the factors which keep moving that baseline. And one of the goals might be to if the baseline is kind of here, or you keep trying to get it here, then focusing on a baseline which is 20% lower than you would like it to be, to at least get solid and get established there. I'm a really big fan of having a stable baseline which is lower than you'd like it to be, than a baseline which is unstable, and then it's not really a baseline that keeps on going up and down. And Camilla's just commented that she also finds it a challenge, but she's having some support from Gemma, one of the psychology team, and she's been a great coach, which I'm not surprised to hear, but I'm pleased to hear. Yeah, sometimes just having an outside person can really help, because that outside person can help us see the things that we're not seeing. And that's one of the things of, when you're driving a car, there's a blind spot in the car. When you look over your shoulder where the structure of the car is, you can't see. And that's sometimes the case in life, that we can't see, for example, if we've got a massive achiever pattern or a massive helper pattern, we might see it at the extremes, but we're often not seeing it in the ways that it's unfolding day to day. One of the things that's fascinating is people that have achiever patterns that have driven themselves massively in the outside world in terms of their life. They've crashed, they can't do lots of activity in the world, so they say, I'm not doing my achiever pattern. But actually what you see is they're now massively trying to achieve at recovering. And they're trying to get it right, and they're trying to drive recovery. If you want a perfect example of an achiever pattern completely out of control, read my book of my recovery journey. Like, there's one thing, if I had my time again, I would significantly do differently. Just constantly driving to recover in a way which becomes an obstacle to the recovery process. So yeah, taking time, being patient, setting it lower than you want it to be, getting it stable, and then building it from that point, and understanding things in the blind spots. Definitely, I think, would be really helpful. So thank you guys for joining. I will jump on the comments in the next day or two. This time next week, we'll have a recovery story. And then the week after, we will do another one of these. If I'm on paternity leave at that point, I'll see if we can get one of the practitioner team to step in as well. So thank you for watching, and I hope that's been useful. And please do comment underneath.